Hi, and welcome back to the Downhome Podcast. I'm Elizabeth Whitten, and with me today is longtime contributor Dennis Flynn. He's been writing for the Downhome magazine since 2003. In the May issue, he delves into fairy lore for his article, The FairyMonth of May. Thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so Newfoundland is rich in fairy stories, and they were brought over by Irish settlers. And these stories tend to feature mischievous spirits, and they can be benevolent or malevolent. So how old were you when you heard your first fairy story?
Oh my goodness, very, very young. I assume it would be when you were in the crib. So as soon as you were old enough to listen and be able to comprehend a few words, I'm sure that some of the first things that came your way were fairy stories and spirit stories, and these were great sources of entertainment that were passed on in a very strong oral tradition, both in Colliers, where my father is from, and in Bay Roberts, where my mom was from. So both my maternal and paternal grandfathers were great storytellers in their own rights. So I kind of ended up getting a little bit of the tail end of some of their tales.
Right, and it really does seem to be these stories are passed down from parent to child or grandparent to child.
Absolutely, and my dad has kind of put his finger on it that although we tend to think of these, now you tend to think of fairy tales as the Disney version, very sanitized and very cartoon friendly. That's not what they were when they were growing up. They were meant for entertainment, of course, but they're also designed to put a little bit of a scare into young people to keep them safe. I mean, these were times that even if you were on the outskirts of a community, you could be a mile away from home in what they would call liminal territory. And it's a great word, liminal. It comes from Latin meaning threshold. So you're on a threshold of community, but it could be very dangerous in the spring of the year or in the fall, berry picking. You could get astray with the fog. You could get lost in a sudden snow squall, and you could easily die of exposure or tragic circumstances. An accident might befall you. You might step off a cliff to where the ground wasn't solid. So they tell these fairy stories in a kind of a way to make sure that you were aware of being looking out for unknown dangers and just aware of your environment, and that was part of it. But they didn't have early warning systems. They never had any cell phones. You couldn't call 911 or search and rescue. You had to keep your wits about you, and this was one way of doing it in an entertaining way.
Right, and it does strike me that they always have some sort of practical motive behind them. They explain things that people can't control, like a sudden death in the family or a disappearance.
Absolutely. And there's also related, of course, the fairies were, depending on who you talk to, or I'm sure there's lots of different explanations. Some people say they were spirits of nature. Some say they were fallen angels. Others say they were, mystical beings that kind of lingered on after the Celtic from the Celtic traditions. But regardless of where they come from, I look at it as kind of a little bit of an entertainment thing, but also a tie to a much simpler time when you had to be your own source of amusement. There was no TVs, there was no gadgets. You couldn't be on the internet or on your screen time on your iPod or anything else, or your iPhone or anything of this nature. So you had to find a way to convey information, give explanations, but also build a sense of community. And stories were that lifeblood. We were up a while ago on in an area where my grandfather, who died in 1968, we were up looking through the land, just having a walk about, myself and my dad, and he's 76, and we were looking, he said, I find it so hard to believe. He said, I was 14 years old, and I came up here and I helped fence this land with him. And he said, that was like 61 years ago. And we looked and we seen this cable. And he said, that was a cable. That was a ship's cable. And he unwound the cable and he used one strand of the ship's cable as a top marker for his fence. Now, of course, that fence was long gone and the land wasn't used anymore. But the cable remained. And you could see places where it dipped below the emerald moss and then it would come back up again. And it would cross a tree. And there'd be bits and pieces gone, but lots of it stayed. And there's parts where, a var tree had grown around the cable and the wound that had offended it had become a womb to protect it, to inoculate it and to just preserve the story. And that's kind of what fairy stories and spirit stories are. They are that little single strand back to the past that we don't always know all the story or what the purpose was, but we can find a marker and we can pick it up and, make it our own and bring it forward.
Right. And I guess that also ties into why they're so popular and continue to be passed down.
Absolutely. It's one of those things that, you go, as soon as you mention it out in, now it's funny, if you go a community, in Colliers it was very strong, places like Georgetown, Marysvale was very strong. Bay Roberts, not quite as much, but in places where there were little pockets of Irish Catholics, it seems to really have struck a nature and hung on there. I was talking to some folks down in Renews and Capahayden and the Witless Bay and the Southern Shore, all that Irish loop, and very strong down there. But I remember being in Francois on the south coast, and beautiful, haunting landscape. I mean, surreal. Everywhere you look, there's rocks that have features in them that could be, ghosts or goblins or ghoulies or anything of this nature. And I asked the gentleman, a retired fisherman, George Fudge, I said, must be some great ghost stories here now, Mr. Fudge. And it was primarily English settlers there. And he said, no, he said, not really, no ghost stories. He said, we weren't really that kind of people, no ghosts or fairies or anything like that. He said, and his point was well taken to me. I said, if there had been an Irishman drop off here 100 years ago, within 10 minutes there would have been fairy stories here, or he would have brought him with him, one or the other, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And there are a number of ways people can avoid being the victims of these supernatural creatures. And I'd heard about turning a piece of clothing inside out or keeping a piece of bread or iron in your pocket. In your research, did you hear any stories and tips you'd never heard of before?
Well, it's interesting. So, and again, like I said, I take all this with a grain of salt. I look at it as primarily entertainment, and it's but the people who tell you these stories, with the greatest respect, it's not that they necessarily believe them themselves, but certainly their parents or their grandparents told them as if true, and that's the thing. Whether they believed in the actual beings or in that they believed in the power of the story to have an effect, and a desired effect, a desirable effect. So, so one of the things, again, like I said, wearing clothing inside out was a common one, like an undergarment or a shirt or a hat backwards. Sometimes if you encountered a fairy ring, which could be like a natural phenomenon, it could be wildflowers in a ring, or a ring of trees growing off somewhere by itself, or even darker grass circles on the ground that were naturally occurring. You could toss a glove in there, they say, and some people would also wear at different times, especially in May. May was considered to be the fairy month around home. You could wear like a medal, a religious medal was often a good protection. And the reason, I was talking to a gentleman named Michael Fortune, who's a wonderful storyteller and a researcher out of Ireland, Wexford, Ireland area, and he said that in his estimation, in his research, he figures that although it's not hard and fast proven, but he figures that it was probably a tie over to the old Celtic calendar that predated Christianity, that May 1st was a special month. I guess things were coming back to life, spring, rejuvenation, so spirits of nature would be abounding, right? So there's a couple of things like that you could do to avoid the fairies. Also in May, it was never a good idea to move into a new house in May. Barbara Murphy out of Colliers said that growing up, the tradition was if you moved into a new house in May, you brought the fairies with you. So you brought in these mischievous, potentially mischievous spirits. You never used a broom. You never bought a new broom in May. Same reason. You'd basically sweep out the luck out of your house or sweep in the fairies.
Yeah, I never actually heard of. I heard about a lot of these that you brought up, but I'd never actually heard about moving into a new home in May.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? And and that could go, and it's similar. Like there were so many, and I do kind of attribute it to this little practical reason that it wasn't a really, really rich area where we were from, but it was rich in not financially rich, but rich in terms of culture. So they had a wealth of stories and songs, and they had big families, and there was and it was an area ringed with harbors and rivers and mountains and all these wonderful names, like even the names kind of kind of denote a mystical landscape. Like we have an area that's called Purgatory, and another spot called in my community called Enchanted Pond, which, you know, they say a spirit went in the pond and drove all the trout out, and there were only eels left. But of course, Enchanted Pond had these springs, these cold water springs that would come up, and the ice wouldn't freeze properly. So, you know, the idea being, if you had told there's a spirit in there, maybe kids will stay away from it, and they'll stay off these dangerous areas of unsafe ice. So you can see the practical reason for it. There's spots called Man-o-War Ridge, where they say pine trees grew big enough to cut masts and spars of sailing vessels. The places, there's another spot called Journey's Gallows, this crazy old rock down the north side where, you know, supposedly some ghostly spirit was hung. The Red Rock, where a little ghostly girl wanders around, and she wandered there for years and years until they changed the road and they pushed the rock out in the beach a bit further. And now I guess she's either at rest or she's underwater, so one or the other. But we haven't seen, nobody's seen her in a long time. Eh?
Can you share maybe your favorite fairy story?
Well, I sure can. I mean, there's a great one, and I'll change the names a little tiny bit. But just because there's probably people, it's a true story, or told as true. There's probably people still related, so I'll just put it in broad strokes. But there was a gentleman out home who was a trapper, a very well-known trapper, you know, going back maybe 70, 80, 100 years ago. And he used to go maintain a trap line. It'd take him about a week or so to do. And he'd leave from Colliers, and he'd walk in the woods and do his trap line. And he came back this day after being on his trap line. He had what we would call a brim bag, like a cloth, heavy cloth, coarse material bag over his back. And he laid it down the back of the house, and his wife asked him, "So what do you got in the bag?" And he said, "You remember?" We'll call him Fred. You see, remember Fred went missing about 25 years ago or so? I said, "Yeah." He said, "I got Fred." And he said, "What do you mean you got?" His wife said, "What do you mean you got Fred?" He said, "I have Fred. You know, I found him. He said, I was up in the woods, and I was sat down in a spot of pond against a mossy bank." And he said, "I was taking out the makings of a cigarette." And he said, "I was just rolling up my cigarette and about to strike the match." And he said, "I looked over and I spied Fred looking at me out of the bank." And he said, "Well, really all I spied was what was left of Fred, his skeleton." And he said, "I pulled back the bank, and there he was." And I said, "Well, what am I going to do with him?" And I gathered up his bones, and I said, I put him in the sack and took him with me. And the missus said, "Well, why'd you take him with you?" He said, "Well, I figured, you know, I got to bring him out for a Christian burial." And she said, "That's great. You know, it's a good thing to do. But why did you take him? You're only a day or so in on the trap line. Why take him? Like, why not come home with him?" He said, "Well, Fred was 25 years in the woods." He said, "I didn't think another week could hurt him." And they say that, of course, that poor Fred was a great woodsman, and he was very familiar with the area. So there was no explanation. He had gone in the woods to find a spot of pine to do a bit, cut some wood. And there was no explanation for why he should have gotten lost in an area he knew really well. And of course, the logic of the time was that the fairies took him. He was led astray. And once you get into fairies, it's very difficult to get out. You can be in an area that's quite accustomed to you, and you get disoriented, and you wander around until you either get rescued or, God forbid, something less than desirable happens to you, as was the case with Fred. But so that's kind of one that was told, and they told it in a kind of a more a humorous way, but the message was there that don't let this happen to you. Keep mindful, don't offend the fairies, but also keep an eye on your back path, keep an eye on the weather conditions. Don't take for granted that you may only be a small way from home, a day's walk from home. That you shouldn't be complacent out in the world. So that's kind of one of the ones I really like. The other ones you like are the stories of the related things, like the death tokens and the fetch, which is another great like a ghostly double, which would presage something about to happen. So these are kind of wonderful things. There's a great photograph of the Newfoundland sealing disaster, and I don't know the photographer. I don't think it's actually attributed, but it was about April 4th, 1914 when they're coming back from the Newfoundland sealing disaster. 132 men trapped on the ice. Something like 77 of them perished. But there's a photograph of Skipper Tom Dawson of Bay Roberts, and he's being lifted down the gangway. He suffered frostbite and lost both his legs. His legs were amputated. He lived, of course, but he had prosthetics afterwards. Now, he was a cousin of my grandfather in Bay Roberts, and they say that Skipper Tom would often tell the story that when he was breaking the lead, he was master of the watch. And what a great title for a job, master of the watch, And he was breaking the lead through the hard and deep snow and for others to follow. And eventually, on the second night, he got tired and he lay down to sleep, and everyone figured that was it. He was going to die. And they say the men stacked some bodies around him, and they figured he was gone. He woke up and he lived. He hung on long enough to get rescued eventually. But what was interesting was that he often, and I think Cassie Brown may have mentioned it or told the story in her book as well, Death on the Ice. But he often would say to my grandfather that he dreamt that one of his good friend was Captain Abe Parsons. He dreamt that Captain Abe Parsons' daughter had appeared to him in a dream on the ice and told him to hang on, that her father was coming to rescue him. And so it's kind of powerful when you hear these stories as a little boy. You kind of say, "Oh wow, that's great. That's an amazing story." So it just ties into history for you. It allows you to find a way of, even for common people, to make connections to deep historical moving events in the province. So when you grow up around these kind of stories, it's kind of natural that you would want to pursue them a little more.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing those stories.
Oh, totally my pleasure. Absolutely.
Thanks for listening. Downhome Magazine's May issue is out on stands now, so you can pick up and read Dennis Flynn's article, The Fairy Month of May. You can also head on over to the Downhome website at downhomelife.com.